So what we'd like to do to wrap up this little basic postural analysis is ask the question to you all, our viewers. Do you see what I see with Kerstyn's posture? So as we start pointing out some deviations on the norm, sounds like a statistic class, doesn't it? But what we'll do is right now Kerstyn is standing in her real world posture. And if you were instructing Kerstyn and if you were looking at her posture now with what we've talked about previously, could we apply that knowledge to help correct some issues with Kerstyn's posture so that she does fall into alignment and she does fall into symmetry? So again, we're always going to start at the bottom. We like to have a good basement, good foundation for a good solid house. So when I look at the feet on Kerstyn, and again, she's standing in her own typical posture, what do you see? Take a look for just a moment. So now I'm going to cue you into a couple things. When we look at Kerstyn's feet, I see that this foot is slightly ahead of the other. And I'll tell you in just a moment about how that translates about coming from the pelvis. So we're going to be asking Kerstyn to move this foot back about a half an inch or so. Now, when I look at her foot placement, what do you see? Do you see a rolling in or a rolling out? Is it only one of the feet? Is it both? These are questions you can ask of yourself too. But I see a deviation here where Kerstyn's middle two toes are off to the side. So I'd be asking her to line that up squarely, again, to line up with the middle of her ankle. Now, the other thing I would ask Kerstyn is to feel the four corners of her feet. 1, 2, 3, 4. 3 and 4 are the heels. And to feel like the weight of her body is evenly distributed right through the middle of that foot. And that helped to true Kerstyn's foot posture up very nicely. Now, as I'm traveling up the leg and we look at Kerstyn's posture, what do you see? Do you see any deviations there? Do you see anything that you might be mentioning to Kerstyn about bringing that into symmetry, into alignment? And when I look at her knees, I do see that her kneecaps are pretty nicely lined up right through that plumb line that we talked about before. I'm looking at the bottom of her kneecaps. Are they relatively level? And I do see that. And that's a really nice thing for Kerstyn. However, when we go over to the side view, I'm going to point out something that I'm seeing from the side. Now, as we move up into the ball and socket of the hips, let's take a look and see what's going on here. Do you all see any deviations, or do you see symmetry with those hips? And as I look at the ball and socket area of the hips, I'm seeing a slight, not a lot, but a slight roll in here. So I'd be asking and working on just a little bit of an outward rotation right in that ball and socket. Now, the ever important pelvis, this is so important in any kind of activity or daily posture. When we look at the overall set of the pelvis, and we'll see more from the side too, but as you're looking through this structure, what do you see with Kerstyn's posture? Sometimes clothing is a giveaway as well. You can always pay attention to how clothing drapes on you. Do you see that we have a slight dip over here? It's not big, but it's slight. This hip right here, the crest of this hip compared to this one, you see the height difference there? So we would definitely be talking to Kerstyn about how to lengthen up. So I'd ask her, can you lift a little bit higher? Right there. And she made a beautiful adjustment for us. Now I'm going to travel up through the rib cage. And what do you see there? Kerstyn's clothing is pointing out something to me. I'm wondering if you see that as well. Do you see this folding of her clothes right here? That means that there's a little shortness in through the rib cage compared to this side. So what we'd ask Kerstyn to do is, again, lifting through the rib cage, growing that just a tad, and there. And then we've leveled off her hips again. So clothing can give you a lot of giveaways about what's going on with posture. Now, when we move up to the collarbone area, the pectoral area, what do you see there? And do the clothing give any kind of hints at all? I'm seeing a little bit of a wrinkle here, and what that tells me is that this shoulder is a little bit farther back than that one. Again, it's not a big deal, but if you're, as we like to say, getting into the weeds with a client, you might be noticing this and talk about what kind of deviation that is. And for Kerstyn, that's a little bit of an opening, a little bit more than this side over here. Now, finally, from the front, I'm looking at the arm drape. And so there's something that I bet you all see right now with the drape of the arms. Kerstyn just chuckling. You see how this hand and arm are so much farther forward than this other side is. Now, the simple thing to be saying to Kerstyn would be, oh, just take that arm back. But it hasn't corrected anything that's going on in the core. So what we'd have to ask is, if I have one arm here and one arm here, that tells me I've got a little bit of a rotation going on through the spine. And we'd need to work on making sure that both of these headlights are straight ahead instead of this backward rotation over here. Her fingers look good. We've corrected a little bit by just gently bringing that hand back. And so now she's very nice and trued up. And then when I look at the head, I see that the chin, the tip of the nose, and the middle of the forehead are right up through the middle of the sternum and off that clavicular notch. Very nice posture with the front of the head. So we'll move over to the side on Kerstyn, and what we see is...
You don't have to put it down.
You can keep talking.
Okay.
Does this side work?
Yeah. Oh, it's great. It's great. Yep.
Starting 3, 2, 1.
And so when we look at the side of Kerstyn, again, I was looking at a plumb line from the ankle through the knee, through the hip. And Kerstyn, I'm just going to borrow your arm forward a bit so we can see that line. There we go. So as you're looking at Kerstyn, or you're thinking about your own posture, you see some deviations here. So what I see from this is that there's a greater opening with this knee and a little bit more of a bend with this knee. I'd be asking to lengthen this knee up a little bit. That's going to change that tip of the hip that we saw from the front. And also it drops more knees into a nice plumb line underneath her hip sockets. Now, we had talked about this, what we call an anterior tip of the pelvis before. And we'd asked Kerstyn to please draw the navel in to the back of the pelvis a little bit more to lengthen out this lumbar spine area and to drop the top of the hip into a plumb line into the hip joint, the hip socket itself. And by Kerstyn just simply engaging the abs, she really got a nice drop of that hip and created a nice plumb line for herself. Now, when I'm traveling up the side, what I'm going to ask you is take a look at Kerstyn's shoulders, her neck, and her head as she's standing in her own posture. So think about that plumb line coming up through the base of the neck, in front of the ear, and up through the crown of the head. And you may see a deviation of Kerstyn's head and chin leaning forward. So Kerstyn and I have talked about this previously, but what you can do is take the back of the head right here and ask Kerstyn, could you come directly back and find me there? So we have just a little bit more lengthening to bring the jawline and the base of the neck into alignment. Also, when we see a lot of what we call tech neck forward, it can really pull up and forward into the shoulders, opening up and loosening the back muscles, but unfortunately tightening and contracting the pectorals and the fronts of the shoulders here. So Kerstyn was kind enough to allow us to go through deviations that her posture has. But I hope it was useful for you to start using your knowledge about postural analysis and really applying what you've seen for those landmarks onto Kerstyn's body and what you would ask her to do to correct those. And then what can you do with yourself or with your friends? Thank you so much, and we thank Kerstyn for being such a lovely model.